Well, good morning, friends. My name is Don Stelluto, and I'm the Associate Director for the Notre Dame Institute for Advanced Study. And it's a great pleasure to welcome you on this bright and sunny, well, not so sunny morning. I have the pleasure of serving as facilitator for this morning's session. It's also my pleasure to invite you into this discussion that brings together scholars from multiple disciplines to examine this fundamental question about the idea of participation. And before we welcome this morning's presenters, I would like to express the Institute's great thanks to the John Templeton Foundation. It is due to their generosity and through a grant to the Notre Dame Institute for Advanced Study that we were able to make possible this Templeton Colloquium at the NDIAS. Before we begin, a few words about this colloquium. This colloquium was conceived of by Douglas Hedley, one of this year's Templeton Fellows at the NDIAS. Douglas desired to spark an interdisciplinary discussion with a number of scholars on this fundamental topic, and so he set out some initial thoughts in his pre-circulated paper, but he wanted to do much more. His intent was to have our presenters and all of you respond to, comment on, and engage Douglas on what he had presented and to offer additional ideas. He particularly sought ideas that emanated from distinctive and particular perspectives from various disciplines and fields. His intent was to foster a broad, thorough, but less formal discussion about participation. And to Douglas's credit, an objective of this colloquium is to have multiple, even divergent perspectives presented. This is one of 8 sessions that we're having over 3 days designed to accomplish these objectives. Our format for this session this morning will have 3 parts as follows. First, Douglas Hedley will offer a few words to explain how this session plays a role in the larger issues he pursues about participation. Second, we will have our 2 presenters, Stephen Clark and Gretchen Reydams-Schils, present their thoughts on the topic of ancient philosophy and participation. This will be followed by Douglas Hedley, who will provide a brief response and commentary. The third and final component of this morning's session will be the larger discussion for all of us here. This will include time for your questions and comments, as well as those from individuals watching this session via the university website and who may have questions that they're posting through the Colloquium blog. As you have questions or comments this morning, please come to the microphone. We'll have a microphone available. And we ask that before asking your question, please identify yourself so that others may hear you, as well as speaking loudly when posting your question. Our presenters this morning are Stephen Clark, Gretchen Reydams-Schils, and Douglas Hedley. Stephen R.L. Clark is Professor Emeritus from Liverpool University. His research interests include the philosophy of Plotinus, the treatment and understanding of non-human animals, G.K. Chesterton, and the philosophy of religion. He is the author of 18 books and more than 200 articles, book chapters, and other shorter scholarly works, as well as several edited works. His most recent books include Ancient Mediterranean Philosophy, Philosophical Futures, Understanding Faith, Religious Belief, and Its Place in Society, G.K. Chesterton, Thinking Backwards, Looking Forwards, and Biology and Christian Ethics. He has served on the editorial boards of numerous scholarly journals, including the Journal of Applied Philosophy, the European Journal of Philosophy, the British Journal for the History of Philosophy, and International Journal of Technoethics. Gretchen Reydams-Schils is professor and chairperson in the program of liberal studies and concurrent professor in the departments of philosophy and theology at the University of Notre Dame. She specializes in the traditions of Platonism and Stoicism, and Professor Reydams-Schils is the author of Demiurge and Providence, Stoic and Platonist readings of Plato's Timaeus, the Roman Stoics, Self, Responsibility, and Affection, and more than 40 scholarly essays and other works. She has received fellowships from the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation and the Center for Hellenic Studies. She is also the recipient of numerous grants from organizations such as the Earhart Foundation and the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. In addition to her administrative duties, she also directs the Notre Dame Workshop on Ancient Philosophy. Douglas Hedley is Reader in Hermeneutics and Metaphysics at the University of Cambridge, and he currently serves as a Templeton Fellow at the NDIAS. He specializes in Neoplatonism, the Cambridge Platonists, aspects of Romantic and Idealist thought, and the philosophy of religion. His monographs include Sacrifice Imagined, Violence, Atonement, and the Sacred, Living Forms of the Imagination, and Aids to Reflection and the Mirror of the Spirit, Coleridge, Philosophy, and Religion. He is the principal investigator of a United Kingdom Arts and Humanities Research Council grant entitled Revisioning Cambridge Platonism, and he currently serves as co-chair of the Platonism, Neoplatonism group at the American Academy of Religion. Without further ado, I turn it over to Douglas Hedley, Stephen Clark, and Gretchen Reydams-Schils.
Well, Don, thank you very much. Can everybody hear me? Good. Well, the obvious starting point for any account of the concept of participation is Plato's doctrine of ideas and the relationship between these ideas and the material cosmos, and Plato's language of sharing, of taking part in, of participating in that doctrine of, or in that realm of ideas. But of course we have some severe hermeneutical problems here, given that Plato wrote in dialogues. How do we know what Plato himself thought? Then of course there's all the speculation about the chronology of Plato's thought. So it's particularly important that we start off by considering what does participation mean for Plato, and it's a very great privilege and honor to have Gretchen here to enlighten us on this topic.
Well, I'm not sure about enlightening. I think I may make things more complicated. If you work on ancient philosophy at a conference like this, you have the privilege of presenting a paper at 8:30 in the morning. And I'm not awake. I hope you are, but I'm not. The only thing that I ever did that was more challenging was to teach metaphysics and epistemology at 8 o'clock in the morning to a group of undergraduate students. So what I thought I would do, I would like to do this more seminar style. And that's the first thing. I will not read a paper. And the second thing that I would like to do is sort of borrow a heuristic mode from the Middle Platonists, the Platonists before Plotinus and company, and use their questions as heuristic devices, so that hopefully those questions can spill over into the other presentations and can help you shape the discussion as you move forward. So, Plato's Timaeus is a very dangerous text. It can lure you in and never let you go. And I think that's what happened to me. I think I will have a lifelong association with this work of Plato. Just to remind ourselves, to set the stage a little bit, so I will focus on the Timaeus, which is really the dominant work in this earlier phase of Platonism. And I'm talking about the 1st century BC and the first 2 centuries AD, so I'm not talking about the Old Academy or the skeptical phase. But in that phase, it's the Timaeus that is dominant. From Plotinus onwards, it's the Parmenides with its very complex and technical issues that becomes the focal text to talk about participation. And I think my colleague Stephen Clark will be able to talk about that and pick up the baton for me on that point. But just to remind ourselves, so the Timaeus is Plato's account of a demiurge. Demiurge is divine artisan, it's just a word for it in Greek, ordering the world by turning to the paradigm of intelligible reality. So it's a cosmogony and it's a cosmology. But as a number of you know, the account, it's actually sort of a monologue, it's not in the usual dialogue form, is presented by the character Timaeus, and it's called an ekos mythos, a likely account. And of course people, ever since Plato said that, have been wondering what that means for the actual epistemological status of the account. Be that as it may, we have this, really I have to put this in quotation marks, we have this mythical figure of the demiurge, this divine artisan, who is some kind of mediator between the forms and physical reality. Now, one of the reasons, and this it really may be worth reminding ourselves of this point, one of the reasons that the Timaeus in particular became so important and influential in the tradition is that it got linked up with Genesis very early on. So you have Plato's account of the order of the world, and then you have Genesis. And as far as we know, given our evidence, this already happened in the 2nd century BC in the writings of the Jewish Greek author Aristobulus. And of course, as a number of you know, it's really in Philo of Alexandria work that Genesis and the Timaeus become the two pivotal points of his analysis. And then a second point worth mentioning is through accidents of historical transmission, really. It's the 4th century Latin commentary on and partial translation of the Timaeus by an author called Chalcidius, about whom we know next to nothing. It's really thanks to this commentary in Latin that the Plato that was known by the early Middle Ages was largely the Plato of the Timaeus, right? So you have the loss of the knowledge of Greek. You really have the shrinking of access to Plato's works, and for a while, thanks to this commentary, which is in fact not of the complete text, but of part of the text, the author of the Timaeus becomes Plato. That's it. That's what Plato stands for, largely. I mean, there are some other passages that were translated, and of course there were some works of Boethius circulating, but the Timaeus loomed really large as a result of this really historical accident. So, in raising a number of key issues, questions that the Middle Platonists, of whom you may never have heard before, I grant you, but as I think they really are a very useful heuristic device for this conference. So while I'm looking at the questions of these authors that transmitted the Platonic heritage, I like to focus also on the Stoic contribution to this tradition. Most of us are familiar with the debate between Plato and Aristotle on participation. But I think that the polemic with the Stoics was at least as formative in this earlier phase of coming to terms with these questions. So that will be an accent, that will be an emphasis in my presentation. I will bring in some elements of that approach. Because after all, we should remember, it's worth remembering, that Stoicism is the big rival account to the Platonic Aristotelian mode of looking at the ordered universe. And it may come up in other forms, in other guises in the course of the semester, but Platonism wasn't the only way, and eventually the Platonic and the Aristotelian modes got combined, as unlikely as that looks to us based on our reading of Aristotle and his critique of Plato, but that's in fact what happened. But Stoicism was a major rival account, and it is true that from Plotinus onwards, let's say, Stoicism got tamed for a while, subdued, but it kept sort of raising its head in all sorts of interesting ways in the history of philosophy. So, which questions are we getting from the Timaeus that I think would be useful for this endeavor? And I'm going to focus the questions around two issues. First of all, what is this divine? Because after all, the title of the conference is not just participation in the forms, but participation in God. And the second one, obviously, given that we're talking about participation, what is the relation between being, and I deliberately use being, not forms, because that's the language of the Timaeus. What is the relation between being and physical reality? So the first question, not surprisingly, then turns around, what exactly is this demiurge, this divine artisan? And there really are two aspects, main aspects to this question. The first one is the Timaeus, given what the Timaeus is, its mode of exposition. We have many different levels of the divine, right? So we have the paradigm of being that serves as the model for the universe. We have this demiurge. We have the younger gods to whom this demiurge delegates some of the tasks. We have the world soul. There is such thing as a cosmic soul in the Timaeus, which is, of course, itself divine. And there are allusions to the traditional Olympian gods. So what do we do with all those different levels? And one feature, for example, that shows up in Middle Platonist accounts to try to come to terms with this is that they will start positing that being does stand for the Platonic forms, and that the Platonic forms, in effect, are the thoughts of this God. So they're borrowing from Aristotle's unmoved mover, or the pure self-thinking thought. Okay. The second really important question is a fundamental tension between two aspects of this divine principle. The first aspect is noetic, and I'm using noetic because that's a term derived from nous, which is a term that they themselves would have used. So what I mean by the noetic aspect of this God is precisely the God insofar as he turns to the intelligible realm, to being, and who then gets interpreted as pure thought, like Aristotle's unmoved mover, the divine thinking itself. So what in the Timaeus is phrased as looking at the paradigm of being, but we all know that this is also, of course, related to notions of theoria, which is, after all, also related to the verb theastai in Greek. But that gets shifted, if you want. This looking at the paradigm of being is turned into a God thinking the forms. So that's the noetic aspect. But of course, if you're looking at the Timaeus, you also have the so-called relational aspect, namely the aspect of a God engaged in the ordering of a world, right? I mean, he turns to the world, he cares enough about the world to bring this order about. And it's this aspect of this divine in Plato that will eventually develop into a full-fledged notion of providence. And this sort of goes back to my earlier work. I mean, one of my hypotheses has always been that this development in Platonism really happens under major influence of Stoicism, and it's a co-opting of major Stoic thought. All right, so that's for this divine entity, right? So we've talked about what is it, what is the connection between these different levels of the divine in the Timaeus, and how can we make sense, at least, of the tension between this noetic aspect and this relational aspect. So, second main issue, let's turn to the relation between being and physical reality. And here things become actually quite interesting in the Timaeus, and it's a pity that Ken Sayre isn't here, because of course he is a specialist of Plato's late ontology and problems of participation. But let's just notice a couple of points, contrasts really, given how this text got interpreted in the tradition eventually. First point, strictly speaking in the Timaeus, the human beings are not meant to imitate the demiurge, right? We're not talking about participation in the demiurge, we're not talking about that kind of imitation. The demiurge is this mediator. And at the end, that's all he is, really. And at the end, I mean, this is a very famous passage about becoming like God. At the end of the Timaeus, Plato enjoins human beings to order their soul properly, which, as we all know, means reason, enhancing the functioning of reason, but to order their soul properly by aligning themselves with the world soul, right? So you get this alignment between human soul and world soul. But of course, through this imitation of the divine, Plato's readers are supposed to remember that the world soul itself owes its order, owes its being to the paradigm of being, right? So the world soul points to a dimension beyond it, towards this more a transcendent dimension of being. So we are really aligning ourselves with being, but via an alignment with the world soul. Second point that I'd like to register is that, and this is not often recognized enough, and it's really, I think, important in the context of this conference, is that the Timaeus deals with a very specific issue. It doesn't just deal with participation. One could look at participation at a given moment in time, and we ask then the famous question, what makes something what it is? For example, something beautiful is beautiful because it participates in the form of the beautiful. That is sort of a standard Platonist account. But the Timaeus deals with a much more complicated question. It's not just what makes something what it is, but how can we account for order persisting throughout processes, dynamic processes of change? How can we account for order persisting over time when you're dealing with nature, when you're dealing with this kind of dynamic, evolving structure? So really, the Timaeus is Plato's attempt to explain what I would call ordered processes. And we all know what Aristotle's answer to that was. I mean, that's his whole system of potentiality and actuality. And in recent secondary literature, there has been a tendency to sort of interpret, particularly in Anglo-American circles, to interpret the Timaeus from this Aristotelian point of view, but I think that's a mistake. There are similar undertakings, but this is Plato's answer to the problem of ordered processes, which Aristotle responded to, and we really should try to focus as much as we can on what was distinctive about Plato's answer, as incomplete and inchoate as it may be in the Timaeus, because of course I can't talk about this, but you have the enormous complicated sets of issues around the so-called receptacle. There is this medium in the Timaeus, and which I will talk a little bit more about, but which is of course really a very, very tough nut to crack. Now, third point, strictly speaking, we're not really dealing with participation in the Timaeus at all. So what I mean by that is that it's not metexis, or metecho, or whatever it is, whatever form you use, and it's cognates that is central to the language of the Timaeus. And I think that's actually what makes the text interesting. Now, Sarah Brody, in a recent book of the Timaeus, has actually gone very far, too far in my opinion, to in sort of pushing participation out of the text, out of the account at all. But we have to really remember that the dominant language in the Timaeus is really one of image and imitation. It's the eikon language and the mimesis, mimema language. And then there is a whole effect. There is a very wide range of terminology, which is, again, bewildering because we have language that pertains to reflection, things like stamp, form being stamped in wax, and so forth and so on. Pretty much everything except the kind of semantic terminology that really got associated with participation. And, we're talking about reflection. Of course, we're talking about reflection precisely in this medium, this ontological anchor for whatever it is that comes down from the forms to constitute physical reality, which is what Plato calls the receptacle. And so the physical realm as a whole, the cosmos as a whole, is here called an image of the model, right? An image of the paradigm of being. But something rather important happens with mimesis here. And you will have to forgive me. This has to be sketchy because I'm trying to make it succinct. But roughly speaking, it works as follows. In the Republic, it's not 100% consistent, but to a large extent, eikon, image, is reserved. Any language related to image is reserved through the relation between the intelligible realm and physical reality, right? So physical reality is an image of the intelligible realm. Mimesis, on the other hand, everything that has to do with mimema is much more negative. And that's reserved for, we all know, the much criticized relation between art and physical objects. So art is a mere copy of physical reality, which is therefore even more deficient. And of course, that's not really what Plato is saying. It's a lot more nuanced than that. But the standard understanding will have to do for us this morning. So in contrast, what happens in the Timaeus is that the eikon and the mimema language, they're joined. They both apply to the physical world. And moreover, mimema now is not just a negative term or predominantly negative term. It doesn't just stand for the loss of ontological perfection. It also stands for the return to ontological perfection. So it acquires a very positive notion, right? It's those features of the world that are close, that actually reflect this higher reality. It's not what is wrong with our world, it's what is actually good with our world. It's the order that is actually present. And then, as we know, human beings, of course, through their reason, have more opportunities to return to the divine. So I think that's rather important. These sort of reflections on semantic ranges are important for our discussion later on. What is it that we're talking about? We're talking about participation in God, participation in intelligible reality. Are we talking about participation, or are we talking about a different linguistic register? What do those different linguistic registers mean for the way we end up phrasing the question, phrasing the issues? Because one can clearly see that a kind of, I mean, this is very sketchy, but it's really meant as an idea to get us started, that this positive eikon mimema language of the Timaeus will create a different relationship to the physical world, not so much the flight from the world as we often associate Plato with, and possibly also through this more positive valorization of physical reality, opening up a dimension of a more positive valorization of art. I cannot dwell on it, but Pierre Hadot has written a really beautiful article how, through this discourse of the Timaeus, Plato indirectly is also retrieving poiesis. Poiesis is both making and poetry. So there are all kinds of interesting dimensions, I think, that are opened up, which you will not get if you just focus on the traditional technical counts of participation. So finally, my last point to get us going is that I would like to give you at least a glimpse of what I mean by the debate between the Platonists and the Stoics and how it could have shaped the reception or the tradition of the Timaeus. So it's really the early Stoics, so we're talking about the 3rd century, 4th century, 3rd century BC, who co-opted the Timaeus. So the Timaeus was still important in the early academy, but then when the academy goes to a skeptical phase, a text like the Timaeus becomes less important. And paradoxically, it's the Stoics who really continue to read the Timaeus and take it seriously. But they co-opted it. In other words, they massaged it, they tweaked it quite a bit. So it's not they didn't just take over Plato wholesale. So what they did, if you remember the 2 questions that I started out with on the divine, they really came up with a quite radical solution, a quite radical cutting through the knot of some of these tensions by unifying all of these different aspects of the divine into one unified, active divine principle, so that even the, let's say, traditional Olympian gods really become aspects of this divine active principle as it manifests itself in the universe. That's one thing. And B, they really made a radical choice for what we call the relational aspect of this divine principle by making it immanent, completely interwoven with the universe, and by casting it as providence, as a providential agent. Now, there are some passages, I didn't give you the passages that really in a rather succinct way can show what is at stake here. First passage that is often alluded to is that the Stoic Chrysippus had his own reading of the ending of the Timaeus, and we have this, luckily, because as you may know, Stoics were really preserved in a very fragmentary manner, but luckily we have this bit preserved. And you can see how he rewrote the ending of the Timaeus. So he basically kept the alignment between the human soul and the world soul, but he scrapped any potential reference to another additional transcendent dimension beyond. Right? So you keep the Timaeus, but you just, succinctly put, you forget that there is this paradigm of being. Who needs the paradigm of being? The order of the world is in the world, which is, of course, not unlike Aristotle's criticism, but what they did was they reread the Timaeus. They took a radical turn on these questions that I raised earlier. And my final example comes from Plutarch, 1st century AD, probably the most famous of the Middle Platonists, about whom you might have heard. I think some of the others are a little bit more obscure. And he has this account, which is called, it's a bit of a mouthful, but On the Delays of the Divine Vengeance. And what it really is about, it's the problem for anybody arguing for providence, the problem posed by the fact that wicked people appear to escape punishment. So really what it is about, it's a polemic with Epicureans, with some Epicureans who deny providence, and it's really then an argument in favor of providence. So we know, our ears should prick up, that we are already in sort of an area that does owe a lot to Stoic thought, because it's really the Stoics who push this notion of providence to its fullest consequence. And so it's not surprising that Plutarch here can draw precisely from the Stoic camp to make his strong case for the notion of providence. But what I would like to draw your attention to as a final example, or just a little glimpse of what this could turn into, is Plutarch's interpretation in this context of the famous phrase, becoming like God. Right? Plato's Theaetetus, one of the purple passages in the tradition, we are enjoined to become like God as much as possible. It's like, which God? How, right? Well, in Plutarch, in this particular text, this injunction becomes an imitation of the demiurge. So it's the demiurge who now sets himself up as a model for human behavior, the demiurge in his relational aspect, and he becomes the paradigm for human virtuous action. And as I think what I started out by saying, this is not Plato's account. I mean, there's no trace, as in the Timaeus as such, of a human being being asked to imitate the demiurge. But it's, and if you then still hold on to the idea that the forms are the thoughts of God, then you really do get something that we may call, I'm not sure that I would use participation, but we do get something that is more like a participation in God. But paradoxically, under quite a bit of Stoic influence, because we need to emphasize this God, this active divine principle, in its relational mode to the universe, in order to be able to get at this version of becoming like God. And that's actually a glimpse of of the work that I'm doing right now, as the project, my research project, which is really reinvestigating what becoming like God looks like in Middle Platonism, because it has always automatically been put on the side of the Platonic equation of the debate. I mean, what could be more Platonic than that phrase? But as it turns out, precisely in this sort of cauldron of questions and unresolved problems, it really is also a tension between what it would mean for the Stoics to follow God and a Platonist, and you find mixed models under the influence of Stoicism. So this is where I'd end just with a little glimpse of what I'm currently working on, which I hope will also be relevant for your discussion in the days ahead. And let me just close by a parting gift, a little teaser, a little riddle, a riddle enigma. It's just a line, and I will not reveal its origin. Participatio est participatio est participatio. Thank you very much.
Well, Gretchen, thank you very much for this very rich and suggestive paper. I think your arguments about the importance of the Stoic contribution are very convincing here. I suppose that's is not the issue here the question of pantheism as opposed to some, let's call it, for want of a better word, theistic structure. Of course, that's not terribly helpful in relation to Plato as we have him, but to a philosophy where there is a transcendent and immaterial source of the material cosmos. So clearly a pantheistic philosophy like Stoicism can employ the language of participation in a intelligible but nevertheless very different way from a philosophy with a transcendent principle. But both can agree in their repudiation of the Epicurean.
Absolutely. Yeah, that is an alliance. Now, the interesting thing, and I didn't touch on this, did you want to go on, or should I? No, you know, you almost don't need to talk about becoming like God or participation for the Stoics, and the reason for that is that they posit such a radical physical continuity. For example, between human reason and divine reason, or between, you know, the order in physical reality and the active divine principle. So in that sense, the issue of participation really doesn't come up. And because precisely they have this, what I call this radical continuity model, there is no gap to bridge, if you want. And that's also why they tend to prefer the phrase follow God rather than becoming like God, because from their point of view, we don't need to become like God. We already are, right? In our human reason, which is literally a piece broken off of divine reason, there's nothing that we need to become. We are, but the problem is we can lose sight of that. We can go astray. We can fail the optimal use of our reasoning. But that's also very interesting, right? I mean, doesn't participation require, by its very nature, this kind of gap in reality that needs to be bridged?
Yes. Yep.
Okay, thank you. Do you mind if I stand? I've always found it easier to speak if I'm standing. Can you hear me, or shall I lift this out? And does it lift out? That's probably fine.
Do you want to comment on Gretchen now, or do you want to just
I just want to start on my... There are so many things that cross over.
Okay.
Shall I just start?
I think that's probably best. Yep. Thank you.
Okay. Gretchen has said a great many things that touch on the line I was going to take, so I'm slightly changing my line. Not because I disagree, but because I always find it more helpful if speakers actually do disagree. And if I were to say what I was going to say, I would be agreeing with her. So I have to say something else. Equally true, but different. Okay. I'll start with, I think I've probably got 3 items that I want to draw to your attention. And I probably won't develop any of them adequately, and I may well get diverted into something quite different again as I continue. The first is to remind ourselves of a fairly commonsensical interpretation of Plato, which used to be the fashion way back in the 1960s when I was a student, and I still think has quite a lot going for it. Quite simply, some statements are as we say, contingently true, and some are necessarily true. And some, to put it slightly differently, some things can be said to be essentially such and such, and some things are not essentially such and such, but only occasionally such and such. If you want to improve the savour of your meal, you can add a little salt. It will then become saltier than it was. But if the salt... Okay, I can't believe I'm saying this. If the salt has lost its savour, wherewith shall it be salted? Salt is essentially salty. It doesn't have to have something added to it to be salty. That is what it is. Similarly, fire is essentially hot. You don't have to add something to make it hot. You can set something else on fire by bringing fire to it, but you can't very well say you can set fire on fire. It is on fire. That's what it is. So there are some necessarily true statements. Salt is salty, fire is hot. And there are some not necessarily true statements. This room is hot. This meal is salty. Those may or may not be true. Sometimes they're true and sometimes they're not true. If you take your eye off them, indeed, they may cease to be true. If this room was hot at a particular moment, and then there's a failure in the central heating and the snow falls, it will have become cold, which may sometimes be a good thing. Now, in other words, the room is hot. It's not the sort of thing that can enter into a secure knowledge base, because it very well may not be hot. Fire is hot, on the other hand, can enter into a secure knowledge base. So knowledge as a system has to consist of things that can be seen to be necessarily true, whereas things that are not necessarily true can't enter into a secure knowledge base just as such. You may say that you know them, but what you mean by that is that you are pretty certain of them at a particular moment in your experience, and you recognize that they may not be true a moment later. So they're not knowledge. Now that's a pretty commonsensical interpretation of what Plato is often saying, and I think there's a lot for it. However, of course, it's not all that Platonism has been understood to mean, and if one stops there, and I may say that quite a few scholars in Oxford back in the 1960s did stop there, if you stop there, you're missing out an awful lot of what makes Platonism interesting, because after all, we know what I've just said, and if you want to read Plato, you want to be encouraged to see something slightly different. Okay, so there's that. That's a purely commonsensical, if you like, semantic interpretation of the difference between certain sorts of statement, and it emphasizes the necessary connection of some ideas. We can go on a bit, actually. It turns out that we can also identify relationships, actually I just was identifying certain relationships between these high-level, call them concepts at the moment, fire and heat. I said the fire is essentially hot, but actually, having said that, they're not quite the same thing. Being hot is not quite the same thing as being on fire. And being on fire is not quite the same thing as being hot. So the concepts are related, but not, and indeed necessarily related, I would say, but not quite the same thing. So there's an interweaving of the concepts we deploy in understanding our science, our systematized knowledge. Okay, pause there. Another way through, again, still fairly commonsensical, though actually people I notice seem to forget that it's commonsensical. You'll all remember, because even those who haven't read Plato know about this particular parable or myth, the story of the prisoners strapped in a dark cave, watching the shadows on the wall. It's one of the formative myths of Western philosophy, and it appears all over the place since then, and of course people make films of it nowadays. We are in the fortunate position in this generation of having devised the technology to make an awful lot of Plato's myths and metaphors quite obvious. So nowadays you're facing the screen, and all you see is the screen, and you can pretty good guess, well I go back to Plato, a pretty good guess how the figures on the screen will move and what they'll do next. And if they start doing something really odd, you'll start complaining about the lack of continuity in the film and the abrupt changes. But of course you know perfectly well, because you're not permanently strapped in your seat, that what is on the screen is an artifact, is a replica of events. It never actually happened like that in the world. There are just these images, one after the other, presented to you in a reasonable order. Well, of course, we don't actually need to be strapped to our seats. The Babylonian astronomers, I just remark in passing that the Greeks were perfectly aware of the enormous debt they owed to more ancient peoples, to barbarians. They knew perfectly well that a lot of the things they were saying had been said centuries before, and known centuries before. That tends to be forgotten nowadays. We have this image of the Greeks springing like Athena from the head of Zeus, as if they had nobody before the Greeks ever thought about anything. Or grudgingly they thought about a few things, but they didn't put it together in the proper way. The Greeks did. Greeks didn't talk this nonsense. The Greeks knew perfectly well that there were theories at large already. But let's go back to Babylonian astronomers. They took note of the motion of those little pinpoints in the sky, and the motion of those pinpoints in the sky over the night and over the year, and possibly over indeed the centuries. Though it was only in the 3rd century BC that we have definite suggestion that somebody, perhaps called Hipparchus, identified the precession of the equinoxes. It's quite likely that it was identified before. If you watch the motion of these pinpoints obsessively over decades, you notice they do begin to drift. And if you are likely to believe that things drift in circles, then you're going to deduce the precession of the equinoxes. Well, I shouldn't have assumed people know what that is about. Nowadays, the Polaris is the North Star. 2,000 years ago, it wasn't. 2,000 years ago, there was a blank in the sky where Polaris now is. The North Star was a blank, a void. The North Pole, the axis of in the heavens, the North Pole, was blank. Nowadays, the sun rises at the spring equinox, more or less moving into Aquarius, the sign of Aquarius. 2,000 years ago, it was more or less moving into the sign of the fishes. A lot of people made astrological hay with that notion. So there is a motion in these pinpoints, and you can predict them. You can do quite well at it. But of course, you have no idea so far why. And the assumption is that the heavens are going around you, and that went on being the assumption for centuries. Perfectly natural assumption. However, we think, with some plausibility, that these pinpoints in the sky are actually traces, what does one say? Traces, images, replicas, imitations of the actual motions in the material universe. And it turns out, indeed, that those motions are rather different from what we had assumed. Though, and actually, I'll stick with the Ptolemaic version for a moment because it's simpler. The Ptolemaic version is that these are material bodies being wheeled around in complicated ways and showing themselves to us in these patterns. And once you know that, you can begin to predict a bit more coherently and sensibly. One of the great discoveries of the last century was a curious thing called the Antikythera mechanism. Anybody know the Antikythera mechanism? One nod. It really should be known. This was dredged up by pure accident from the Aegean Sea, and it was just a lump of corroded metal. Only gradually people began investigating what it was, cleaning it up, piecing it together, and it gradually dawned on them that it was actually an extremely complicated astrolabe. In fact, let's be blunt, it was a mechanical computer. And with it, people could predict eclipses of the moon and the sun and the motions of the heavens. It was a marvelous piece of work. And of course, it couldn't possibly have been the only one. It was a work of art. This must have been quite common, and we have simply blanked it out in our history, that Mediterranean peoples had devised these beautiful mechanisms relying upon an image of rotating cogs, rotating wheels, to predict these signs in the sky. So we moved on a bit from that. We have more accurate astrolabes, we're working on a different system. We still have this image of the material objects wheeling around in the heavens, of which our phenomenal universe is at best a reflection. What we see in the sky is not the fundamental reality. The fundamental reality, we say, are these material objects, these planetary stars moving against the background of the fixed stars, and of course the fixed stars themselves. And the fixed stars themselves turn out not to be these dimensionless points of light, but globes of fire, or more than fire, beyond our imagination to conceive. We cannot hold in our mind the size and the distance that these things are. That's the vast material universe of which we see only slight reflections. Actually, I'm going to go on with this, and I didn't need to go with that at all in order to try and persuade you that the universe with which you are currently familiar, the phenomenal universe, the phenomena presented to you, are no more than shadows on a screen, that they only represent a reality. Actually, you know that perfectly well. Each of you sitting there, if you're honest, think of yourself as the center of the universe. Of course. You all think that I'm some way away from you, standing at the front of this lecture hall, and I'm presenting to you my voice and my features, and that's all I'm presenting to you. But come on, you know really in your heart of hearts that I am not the image that is present to you. I am not the particular complexion that you happen to see with your particular eyes. Some of you may be colorblind, some of you may have differences of vision. What I'm saying is not exhausted by the sounds that you're hearing. What I am is not exhausted by the sounds you're hearing and the sights you're seeing. I do, I promise you, have a real existence of my own. But you are not directly in touch with it, any more than I am directly in touch with your existence. I believe in it. I believe you are all. The curious figures I see in front of me, I believe, are oddly related to realities, real beings, who continue to exist when you're out of my sight. Though the figures that I see, of course, do not continue to exist when you are out of my sight. That's what I just said. They'd be out of my sight. And if I shut my... Where are you gone? Oh, something reappeared when I opened my eyes. You didn't reappear. I take it, you were still there all the time. Actually, you weren't there at all, were you? You're not there. You're not somewhere else. You're right where you are. You're here. We're all here. There is no other place for us to be. Now, okay, I could go on with that at some greater length, but I hope I've made the point. The idea that Plato was being weird in suggesting that we only see shadows and that the reality is something else. That idea that he was being weird is itself weird. It's plainly not weird to say that. It's the truth. The reality, whatever it is not exhausted by our particular perceptions of it. And we really know that. However, okay, there's the material world, and that's, again, where quite a lot of people stop. Plotinus compared the people who stop there to flightless birds.
Stoics, chickens.
They got some way, but they weren't stirring themselves. Because the material universe, as we now imagine it to be, the one that has no special center, no privilege, let's expand it, has no privileged place. I have a privileged place in my ordinary day-to-day life. It's here, right where I am, and you're somewhere else. But I know that's wrong. I know really this here is not privileged. There are places far away which are just as real as my immediate experience. Actually, I think I go further myself, though it's a moot point and deserves longer discussion than I'm going to give it, or probably we're going to give it. I suspect actually the same is true of time. I'm not convinced that now is privileged. My now is privileged. It's now. But I have to admit that I have good reason to suspect there are other moments in reality than now. And they're just as real then actually, no, they're just as real now because they're now to themselves. The now of all these stereotype images of Harold getting an arrow through his eye in 1066, Washington chopping down trees, whatever it was he did, they're just as real. Why not? They're real at the moment they're real. The moment they are real. All times one can see plausible argument to believe are equally real. All scales are equally real. I have a privileged scale. It's called human scale. But I'm aware, and you are aware, that there are all sorts of things going on at much larger or smaller scales, of which do not appear as such in my phenomenal universe or yours, but they're just as real. There's nothing privileged about the human scale. Turns out, indeed, the human scale is rather an effect than anything else. The realities, we like to say, in discussing the material universe, are going on at a quantum level. And very peculiar they are. They are quite outside our normal frames. So, the material universe has no privileged center, no privileged here, no privileged now, no privileged scale, either in space or in time. It just is what it is. But we like to believe that it's the same everywhere. And this, again, is where Platonism comes in, and Plato comes in. Why should it be that one place, which by definition, one space-time moment, which by definition is different from every other space-time moment, why should it in any way be like any other? Why should we assume, as we do, that the same rules apply, the same patterns appear everywhere in the material universe? Why on earth should they? If the material universe is the end of the story. If that's the end of the story, then there is just an infinite expanse defined by its differences. All points in it are different from every other point. But if they're different, who can put a limit on the difference? If you move over 1,000 light years, things might be utterly different, might find entirely different, as we say, elements or laws. Now, we don't believe that. We do believe very strongly, the same laws will turn out to apply. If they don't, then they weren't laws in the first place. If it's a different pattern somewhere else, then we must have misidentified the pattern here. We believe, in short, that there is an omnipresent pattern which is stamped on every region of the material universe. And that's why we can have these scientific convictions about salt and saltiness and fire and heat and all the rest of it, because the same appears everywhere. So that what appears in one area of the material universe is, as it were, a footprint, a trace of an eternal, abiding reality of which we have some chance of a cognitive understanding. In other words, the world of forms, as Plato put it. Well, actually, Plato didn't put it quite like that, but Platonists did. The realities are the eternal presences, of which there are traces in the material universe as we imagine it, and of course also in the phenomenal worlds of each of us. So there's the reality. I've gone on with that particular theme, it's slightly too long, but I'll now put it on hold. There we are. There's an explanation, a reasonably commonsensical explanation of what the formal, the ideal reality is. It is simply reality. There aren't... People talk about Platonism, and of course the Stoics and Aristotle talk about this as imagining another world than this. That's not quite right. There isn't another world. There's simply the world. There is simply reality. The question is, what is that reality? I know Platonists are right, and I'm suggesting that they have quite a lot going for them. The reality is this complex, interrelated whole of pattern, form, which is stamped upon everywhere, every phenomenal and physical reality, which is encountered everywhere and everywhere all the time. That is the reality of which we have a somewhat distorted view here now. Very distorted in our ordinary sensual existence, somewhat distorted even when we start postulating scientific material universes. However, the question arises, and Gretchen did address this, what sort of reality does this complex of forms have? I've just said it's real. We have to assume it's real. It's what justifies all these convictions about the world and ourselves, and we can sketch them. We can sketch the relations between at least some of these patterns and be pretty confident of them. But nonetheless, you begin to strain against our ordinary sense. They don't. Well, the Stoics were sure, or at least they mostly said, that things affect each other by pushing and pulling, basically. I can push this around, pull it around. Material objects are what affect other material objects. They had difficulties with that because, of course, they did also want to talk about laws, principles, God. This didn't fit terribly easily with the root conviction that its causation is a matter of material pushing and pulling, displacing from one place to another. But still, that's a model we still have. How do the realities, the formal realities, affect everything? And what sort of being do they have in themselves? They're not laid out in space and time. Space and time are a reflection of them. Where are they? Well, as Gretchen said, one of the solutions that Middle Platonists came up with is that they are indeed part of the mind of God. They exist as cognized, eternally cognized. They're eternal beings. Their being can only be as the objects of cognition. Therefore, there is an eternal cognizer. They exist as they put it, as the thoughts of God. Now, that's right, but also slightly wrong for Platonists, because God doesn't think. Doesn't think like us, at least. But we think. We start with one proposition and we gradually advance to another. We think that 2 + 2 = 4, and gradually, step by step, work out that e to the power I pi plus 1 = 0, which is interesting. Very difficult to work out, and eventually you get there. Eventually you solve Fermat's last theorem, if you're very clever and have a lot of computer time. These can be done step by step. God doesn't need to do that. By hypothesis, the God we're conceiving is the complete cognition of everything that is necessarily the case. And he doesn't have to go through steps to get there. So they're not thoughts in that sense. He's not thinking. Indeed, they're not actually, Plotinus is quite clear on this, they're not propositions of the sort I've just mentioned at all. They're realities. It turns out, for Plotinus, that the complete intellectual God it's in some strange way a complex of intellectual realities. The Logos, okay, I'm now moving away from Plotinus into the thoughts of Orthodox Christians, but it's the same point. The Logos contains all logoi. The one Logos, second person of the Christian Trinity, is also the second hypostasis of Plotinus's slightly older and different Trinity. And that Logos contains all eternally existent logoi. Which is why, for Plotinus, the demiurge notion of the Timaeus is a bit wrong. He's quite scornful of it, in fact. He says, let's set this up, you can't really suppose that God, with nothing in mind, set out to create, let us arbitrarily say, it's his example, a horse. To create a horse, he has already got to have the idea of a horse. And what is going on is simply the manifestation of the eternal idea, horse, in of physical and phenomenal reality. So God doesn't create by making in that sense at all. And again, Plotinus gets quite shirty. What sort of tools does he use? Where's this material coming from? The whole story, he says, is wrong. That's not the way to look at it, he insists. Instead, and this is perhaps a topic which we'll come up later on in these sessions, we are to suppose that everything that is yearning towards the eternal reality. That is this eternal logos, eternal being, eternal beauty. Everything that is trying to manifest it. The eternal reality doesn't have to do anything about this. It's an effect of its being is that eternally everything else is seeking to reflect it, is seeking to be like it, is seeking to move towards it. Now, considered as a chronological remark, and of course that sounds a bit peculiar. Things exist because they want to. But Plotinus, surely Plotinus, they must have existed first to have any wants at all. Yes, says Plotinus. Quite agree. They always must have existed first. There is no beginning in the Platonian universe. There is, however, a way of spelling it. If you want to tell a little story, a myth, you do it chronologically. You do it step by step. But remember, that's just a story. Things don't happen that way. Things are already happening that way. Things exist to be proper representations, proper embodiments of certain forms of eternal beauty which are constantly, which are always there and are always being re-embodied, recreated in this image. This phenomenal world, this physical world, are the images of that eternal real. And it's always reinventing itself, producing more and different images of beauty. That's what's going on. I think perhaps I've gone on long enough. I said I had the three things to say. One was the purely commonsensical bit about the other differences between certain forms of statement. The second was my amplification of the reality of things, the difference between the phenomena and the real. And this third, which I've been introducing sort of piecemeal, bit by bit, is this really rather resounding claim that everything in our phenomenal worlds, everything in the material world, is yearning towards expressing an eternal beauty. That beauty is, for us, diverse. There isn't a single beauty. Well, no, that's wrong. There is a single beauty, but for us, it is represented in all sorts of different ways. There are beautiful wombats, beautiful people, beautiful scorpions, beautiful sunsets, beautiful stars. All of them are edging towards this ideal. That's the constant going on of the image constantly reimagining itself. I suppose I should stop there, really, to give you a chance of coming back on it. But there's one other remark I can make. Two other remarks I can make. One, of course, I haven't actually... I've broken off in mid-flight, really, because the divine intellect I've described, as I just said, is the second hypostasis of Plotinus's cosmos. The first is beyond that. The first is rationally incomprehensible. The first is the one. Because the intellect, as I've described it, is irreducibly complex. It's a complex of knower, known, and the knowledge. It's actually a Platonian trinity. That is his expression. It's complex also in containing all imaginable logoi. It isn't a single beginning. The single beginning is beyond that. And in saying it's beyond that, I do not mean it's distant. In saying it's beyond that, I'm saying He's saying it is not trapped in any of our spatial temporal divisions, any of our divisions at all. Because it is beyond all that, it is present, always. Everything is present in it. It's here, right now. Only we don't comprehend it and can't comprehend it in that sense. Anything we comprehend, at best, is going to be the divine intellect. That's the one thing I should say. The second, and I really will then stop, I will force myself to stop, Plotinus does have one other slightly odd remark to make. Both Epicurean... Stoics think that what doesn't happen can't. What doesn't ever happen can't happen. What hasn't happened couldn't have happened. Epicureans, on the other hand, think that everything that could happen does somewhere. Every possible world is instantiated somewhere. Now, for the logicians among you, these remarks are clearly logically equivalent. Everything that can happen does, what doesn't happen can't. Of course, they're very different in their effect. The Stoic universe is complete, finite. Epicurean is infinite and wholly beyond our grasp. Plotinian version is no, not everything that can happen does. Not every entity that could exist does, certainly at the moment. There is more in the divine intellect than is realized in the phenomenal and physical world. Zeus, who escapes from Kronos, is, in a way, the youngest and worst of Kronos' children. The rest of Kronos' children are still stuck in Kronos. They're in the unmanifest. The unmanifest is greater than the manifest. And there I really must shut up.
Well, thank you very much, Stephen, for that. I wonder if I've sensed that Gretchen has been
Poised to speak.
Poised to speak. Yes.
I hope I'm not behaving like Thrasymachus. You know, it doesn't sound very good. You know, no, it's a really wonderful presentation of what is at stake in these ideas. I mean, in this way of looking at reality. I just had actually one small point. Of course, the forms are not in another world. It's not what the Stoics and I think also Aristotle object to is in a way a moving down of phenomenal reality or even physical reality to a kind of lower level, a lower ontological level. It's sort of it gets demoted. And that's something, and I think the other thing that they object to is, or what they will advance in favor of their view of looking at reality is sort of explanatory parsimony. You know, let's explain things in function of themselves rather than like the order that is actually present in the things themselves. But of course, you're right. I mean. And I don't think that Aristotle and the Stoics are that naive to say that. Well, you know, it sometimes does get represented as it's two-world theory because, of course, the Platonists can respond as you did. No, it's not. Mm-hmm. So I think that the problematic is slightly different. It's really about the importance of physical reality as we see it around us.
But that's. I just have to stand up, otherwise I can't breathe properly. I think that both those points are quite fair. Demotion of the phenomena. Well, yeah, in a way, yeah, they are. I mean, but that actually doesn't strike me as very odd or offensive. That doesn't mean the phenomena are worthless. It just means they're not the complete reality, and you don't get an explanation out of things at that level. You don't grasp their beauty just at that level. Beauty is not. I don't think the Stoics. Sorry, this is a remark of Plotinus against the Stoics on the point of beauty, and I think it's perhaps slightly unfair. But the Stoics Plotinus represents the Stoics as saying that beauty is having a good complexion and shape, proportion. And Plotinus says, no, that's nonsense. That doesn't cover what we find beautiful. The beauty, and he instances the beauty of the evening star. That's nothing to do with good proportion. It's a simple. Beauty is not exhausted by the appearance.
Right.
Beauty is, well, Plotinus is a bit obscure about this, but putting it together, beauty is at least that which arouses our life, which it's itself alive. That is why he says a living face is always more beautiful than a dead statue. However well proportioned the statue, the living face is better. So he's not averse. Yes, he's demoting the phenomena, but he's not evacuating it of meaning, and he's pointing to where the value comes in, I think.
Can I make one short?
Yes, and then we'll put it out to the...
The short response is, of course, that we have to be, I mean, in this polemic, the opponents' positions often get reduced, but Aristotle and the Stoics do not just stick to the phenomena, right? I mean, they also recognize that there is an in-depth structure to physical reality, but it is part and parcel of physical reality.
Thank you very much. You can see how this question is deeply connected to the most fundamental philosophical battles and arguments that are still very much with us. Questions from the floor for either of our speakers?
Nick has the microphone. Nick, you want to bring it on up? And if our questioners can also identify themselves before they...
Excuse me, Philip Sloan from Program of Liberal Studies. This is a question particularly directed at Gretchen, but it also feeds into some comments that Stephen Clark made, because one of the interesting things I think you brought out in your paper was when we take a look at this whole question of astronomy. In the Republic, one really doesn't pay attention to the heavens because it's simply decorations on the ceiling. In the Timaeus, as I think you brought out, there is a great concern to pay attention to the exact motions of the planets. And that was really so much to the project of classical astronomy. But the one interesting point that seems to come up is that it seems that the classical program of mathematical astronomy viewed that participation and penetration of reality through mathematics, through Euclidean geometry. And in some ways, that was the key to the participation in the real, but also paying very close attention to what was empirically given. And I think that seems to be quite different than what was the Stoic project or the Aristotelian project, as you brought out. So maybe one of you could comment on that point of participation as actually through mathematics that somehow reaches the reality through the actually given empirical experience.
Well, I agree, actually. I don't think we have very much evidence of Stoic mathematics as such, do we? Stoics were very keen on logic, of course, and developed it very systematically. Aristotle clearly wasn't terribly interested, and again he has some remarks about maths, but he doesn't develop it. Whereas you're right, Plato and the Platonists and the Pythagoreans before them were fascinated by the apparent vigor and fixity of mathematical relationships. They said very many odd things by our standards as to how this worked. And of course, from our rather different mathematics, not again. They dealt with small numbers. I suppose that's the obvious point. and they were mostly small numbers which can be represented, as you were, by pebbles. They're not. They don't develop the relational numbers that we now mostly take for granted. And when they do, they get rather worried about them. So their mathematics isn't quite the same as ours. But yes, they did twig. They did think it very important that the reality was, at least at one level, a mathematical reality. I mean, it did go on with the astronomy parallel I used. I mean, rather you can move from the dots in the sky to the, as it were, the material cog wheels going round, and then you advance to mathematical formulae, in which you don't have to visualize as cogs anymore. You visualize in terms of the workings of initially Newtonian rules, in which you can calculate all sorts of things in an unimagined way. And you go on from there. The numbers are there in reality somehow.
Sweet touches of harmony.
Yes.
Well, what I'd like to respond is, of course, you put your finger on a very important difference between the Republic and Timaeus that people have written about. Because in Timaeus, you're not just interested in finding out the ideal structure of the heavens. You are also interested in observing the heavens. It's actually, you have the famous laus videndi, the praise of sight. You know, why have we been given eyes? So that we can observe, we can see the order in the heavenly bodies. And at the end, too, it's like it's supposed to be, I think, a combination of literal observation and thinking about. We align the human soul with the world soul, both through observation and thinking about. So clearly the empirical dimension stays in the picture to some extent, much more than it does in the Republic. The status of mathematics is absolutely fascinating because, you know, on some level, of course, it's the stepping stone. You're quite right. It's some kind of stepping stone. It's in a divided line from physical reality to intelligible reality. But that, of course, opens up an entirely new can of worms, which is still with us. What is the status of mathematics in relation to reality?
I mean, that is, of course, Plato's complaint against the mathematicians, that they use all these marvelous things, but they don't tell you what a number is.
Yeah, but it's still a problem for us now, the relationship between mathematics and physics. It's not exactly as if we figured it out. Or the reality status of mathematics. But what is it that mathematics actually talks about?
We have time for one more question right down here. Nick's bring the microphone over to you.
Okay. John Betts, Department of Theology. My general question to both of you concerns the relationship between beauty and analogy in Plato, but more specifically in the Timaeus, where Plato, if I remember correctly, calls analogy the most beautiful of bonds. So if either of you could comment on that, I'd appreciate hearing anything you have to say.
What Plato's talking about in the Timaeus is, though, in the creation of the world body, it's some kind of proportional system with bonds, and that's what he calls analogy. So, you know, as V is to W, X is to Y, right? So it really has to do with proportionality, which is, I think, quite more specific than the way in which analogy came to be used in the later tradition. Obviously, the big place to look for analogy is the sun, the analogy between the sun and the idea of the good, which is, of course, a much broader use of analogy. But what is interesting, and I hope that's not too specific a point for you, it's very clear that in Chalcidius' commentary on the Timaeus, the analogy starts to play a much bigger role. It becomes one of the the linchpins of the universe to a much greater extent than in even Plato's own account. But if you want to step back from what Plato actually says, I mean, somebody like, and I'm not going to blank on his name, the argument has been made that mathematics in the Timaeus is actually a form of analogical thinking, or that it's even just like metaphorical. It's just is a transmitter of order from one level to the other. It's some kind, the way literally a metaphor works. So that's one way in which we could sort of try to open it up. But that way of looking at analogy, you really would have to, do things with the Timaeus. Would that make sense?
Well, if I may just thank Professor Reydams-Schils for giving us such an illuminating introduction into the problem of participation, particularly through her highlighting the centrality of the Timaeus and also the Stoic contribution to the particular combination of readings of the Timaeus with the Genesis account in the Middle Platonic period, and with that, of course, enormous influence upon the Neoplatonists, and to Professor Stephen Clark, who fortunately didn't take us into the complexities of the Parmenides, but nevertheless took us into the rich and fruitful account of participation in Plotinus. So thank you very much to both speakers.
Thank you for being a part of this Templeton Colloquium at the NDIAS, and a particular note of thanks to Douglas Hedley, to Gretchen Reydams-Schils, to Stephen Clark for their participation, their contributions, as well as thank you to all of you for your participation, your questions. Special note of thanks to the John Templeton Foundation for making this colloquium possible. We will be taking a brief break for about 15 minutes, reconvening at 10:20, and at that time we invite you to come back and join us for the rest of this morning's sessions, as well as the rest of the sessions today and tomorrow. Thank you very much, and thanks again to our presenters for all of their contributions.